Hey everyone, week 6, rolling right along. Interfaces and interface critique this week is our theme. Two pretty simple articles for this week, so very brief intros here. Mostly I want to focus on some advice for your assignment this week, your archival interface critique. We've already read about power through interfaces in a very general way. Our article a few weeks ago talked about the interface between archivists and archival material, stuff that's in front of them, talked about the interface between historians or users of archives and sort of the archival apparatus, how you find stuff. There's interfaces between the archivist and the physical space and the filing system and digital technology. There's interfaces between the user of archives and that digital technologies. There's interfaces all over the place. And we should think carefully about sort of how these sort of mediate powers of archive as we've been reading about. This week, we're really interested in digital interfaces and how they might facilitate better interactions with archives and maybe minimize some of the problems and issues and limitations that we've been reading about in previous weeks. One thing I think you'll notice sooner or later about the articles is that both of them have very few, if any, direct references to the articles we've been reading. They clearly mention archival power, they mention some of the same issues, and obviously they're responding to some of the same concerns that we've been reading about and you've been writing about. So part of your assignment this week is to more directly relate the articles for this week on organization and interface with the claims about control and silences that we've been reading about over the last month or so. The Jefferson Bailey article, Disrespect de Fond, focuses on the organization of archives. And for our weekly history lesson, he provides a very brief history, but I think a very clear one, an interesting one, on how traditional organizing principles of the archives were put together. And he concludes by commenting on how we might need to shift those organizing principles as our interfaces and storage systems become fundamentally digital. The main historical event here is the French Revolution, which is kind of the basis for everything, really, where simultaneously many archives of the old regime were destroyed, and there was sort of a political renaissance that wanted to create a new archive to legitimate its own power. This led to a new archival system based on the principle of respect de fond, which means respect for the source, respect for the creator. And creatorship then becomes the organizing principle of archival records, meaning collections are organized according to the organization, entity, family, person responsible for their creation. And in cases, this could be the archivist or the person who collected stuff. Often it was the person who created the document that was being saved. And this might remind you of the kind of archives that Owens labeled as papers of so-and-so. This system of respect de fond was mostly for pre-1789, pre-revolution documents, with the idea that post-revolution documents were going to be organized by category or theme or something a little bit more broad than just creator. In reality, though, it was never a perfectly realized system. The pre-1789 documents didn't really get organized by creator. Post-1789 documents got organized by all kinds of different ways. But this idea of organizing things by source, which makes a lot of sense, became pervasive. It wasn't just in France, it really went everywhere. And it was very political, as you can imagine archives are, archives are. It was very functional in many ways. There was no sort of pure organizational principle that ever got implemented anywhere. But this fundamental idea that you need to organize things by creator became the main archival system that we're still dealing with today. And there's always been criticism of it. There's always been people say that this isn't the best way. It obscures this and it emphasizes this other thing. It's got bias. It's got problems. Every system does. Okay, so the criticisms of the system haven't gone unnoticed, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it necessarily, especially if you're working with physical analog archives. Things have to have one system, and it's really hard to change it. Maybe now that we're getting into the digital world, we have some other options, and that's what these two articles are trying to get us to think about. But we can't understand the future of archival organization if we don't understand something about the past and why it is the way it is and why change has or hasn't happened in certain ways. So the result of this respect to fond principle, organize things by creator, is that it becomes ubiquitous. And what's really interesting is that the way an archive is physically organized, and this is obviously changing now in the digital world, but the way an archive is physically organized, you get boxes, you get folders, you get stuff in a physical space, and it has to be arranged in some way, right? I mean, that's the limitations of the physical world. Things have to be in some sort of order, and you can only have things in one order at one time. Those actually shape the way people interact with them. Okay, so imagine that you're researching a famous person or a non-famous person, doesn't matter, a person, and you get their collected works, journal entries, diary, letters, emails. So you have a box of physical stuff that represents stuff that they created. And you're sorting through it, you're looking through it. If you see the order of that stuff chronologically, that will make sense, right? You're in a library, things are organized by time. That you will read those in a certain way. You're reading somebody's personal letters in a certain way, or you're reading somebody's emails from oldest to most recent. That makes total sense. We're all very comfortable with that. But what happens if they're organized by when the library acquired them? They might be all jumbled up. So chronologically, it won't make any sense, but that tells a very different story to the person using the archive. So when they get that stuff, that tells a story in itself of what did that person want to give when. It makes you think about what stuff is more important. Is it the stuff that they gave first or last? Was that kind of an afterthought, the very last things, or is that the most valued? So you read it, right? You create a story in your mind as a user of the archive about how this thing got to be created in the first place. And that's why the organizing principle of respect to fonts is so useful for archives, because it tells a story of that you can't get just by looking at chronology and so on. But the utility of organizing things and just how the library gets it is very not helpful if you're trying to just to understand the story of this person's life, right? So you kind of need both at the same time. Obviously in a physical system, that's really hard. But a digital system, you have a little bit more flexibility with how you can sort of shuffle things around. The idea that an archive would try to preserve or organize things in terms of how they acquired it and how they initially organized it, in a way, it's kind of a nice thing. We've read a lot about power and how archivists wield a lot of power and what they select and what they reject, and that archives should be more transparent. Many of you have written about this in your posts, the importance of archives being more transparent. So the idea of respect to fonts is actually, you can see it as a way of trying to be more transparent. But you can also see in my quick example about how, organizing papers in sort of non-creator ways or non-chronological ways gives to a very sort of clunky usability. So the question is, how can we bring other contextual relations to the same level of privilege as creator or source, or how something came into the archive? How can we bring other contextual relations to the same level of privilege? How can we organize things by different principles at the same time? This is really what Jefferson Bailey's article is about, is how can we think about it differently, not to just implement a new system, but how can we have multiple systems at the same time? Now, he's speaking very theoretically, and he's trying to give us a history of why archives look the way they do. And it's really the second article that starts to give us some more concrete ideas about design and about user interfaces to solve some of these problems. The Mitchell-Whitelaw article more or less picks up where Bailey leaves off. And Whitelaw calls for what he calls generous interfaces. And this is generous in the sense of, giving more to the user than just responding to a generic search query. And he starts with a really provocative question, I think. How did we come to be trapped in the search box? Like whenever you go to an archival site, a library site, the main thing, right? This is true even before Google, but certainly it's been emphasized from their, classic, just there's a search box, that's it. How do we get trapped in that from an archival perspective? And how does that limit how we can interact and discover and explore and connect things within archives? How might the limitations of search and the results pages that we're all familiar with, how might our limitations and frustrations that we have with those lead to richer alternatives. This is what Whitelaw is trying to explore. The idea of searching information in a digital context has a long heritage in information science, in library science, in computer science. It's deeply ingrained in the way people have been taught to manage digital collections for many generations. It's very deeply ingrained in the brains of people writing the software that runs library catalogs. And the limitations of search, just like the limitations of respect to fawn that Bailey is describing, the limitations of search have long been documented. This isn't a new discovery that people have made. The search box is a very limiting feature of archives. People have known this for a while. But what should we do instead? So this is where Whitelaw really shines, and I think it's one of the clearer articles that we've had in the class. So I'm going to leave his ideas to him. He explains them well enough, and he brings up a lot of smart ideas, both in theory and practice, about how we can imagine and implement more creative interfaces to explore and make connections between archival content. Most of the examples he gives are still functional. Some of them have been refreshed and look nicer, look more modern than the images you get in the article. Many of them still look a bit dated. But one thing that strikes me, this article is several years old now, one thing that strikes me is that the interfaces that he shows in his article, even the dated versions, they almost look very refreshing in the sense that so many archival interfaces are so incredibly boring and uninspiring and limited that when you see even older examples that design-wise look a little off and dated, you think, wow, that's a really cool way of getting to information. Why don't we see more of that? And it gives you a sense of the difficulty of implementing some of the stuff he's talking about. And it gives you an idea of how innovative some of the examples he's talking about really are, and the fact that we haven't seen more of those. One last thing about Whitelaw, allow me to paraphrase his conclusion, because it's useful to know where he's going as he works through the theory and practice of generous interfaces. There's 5 things that I want to highlight in particular. 1, provide rich, navigable representations of large digital collections. So how can you easily move through a collection, right? That's sort of a minimum thing. Even now, because we're so focused on information retrieval via search, sometimes we don't find very rich, navigable representations of an archive. We see an item and we see another item. We can search for something. We can click on the, also by this person. We can click on that little tag and go to some other things. But you don't get a sense that you're really navigating the archive in general. You're just kind of clicking from one item to the next. Number two, support search and browsing, things that we're very accustomed to, but also invite exploration. How can we make people want to go deeper into the archive or more broadly across the archive rather than just give them information? Number 3, establish context and reveal details at multiple scales. And I think this idea of multiple scales is super important because it really gets us to think about what is and isn't in the archive and the scope and representativeness of an archive. Normally we look at one item on our page. We just see one thing. We can see another one off to the side. We can kind of scroll through. We can do something like, a Google image search where we see lots of thumbnails and we see sort of a results page visually where we get a sense of a bunch of things at once. But can you zoom in and out of a collection, right? Can you really see just one item and then broaden out, and it gives you just automatically more and more and more items until you have these shadows are crazy. I'm sorry about that. Very distracting, even to me. How can you see the sense of the size of the collection and where you are in it? Sort of what part are you in, right? Depending on how you relate things, obviously. But how do you represent different scales? Number 4, that's 4 out of 5. Use multiple fragmentary representations to reveal the complexity and diversity of cultural collections. I have no idea what he means by this, but I think it's really interesting to think about sort of deliberately restricting what people see about a particular item or an image or a representation so that it's fragmentary. So it makes you think about sort of what part of the whole is this? Again, thinking about the question of scale. But let's say you do a Google image search of Greek vases. Okay, let's say it's the black and orange kind with different mythology, iconography, and so on it. You see an image, you see all the different thumbnail sketches, that's fine. But what happens if if it automatically zoomed in, you just saw just the middle part, right? So you don't really see the whole story, you just see it in the detail, like really, really zoomed in. So you see the actual like technique of the vase. That's a very different way of thinking about sort of how this stuff is connected by sort of the physicality of it, or what are the different color, balances between the different vases. How deep are the engravings, right? You just see it at a different scale. You just think about how things might be connected physically, rather than just the general imagery, which is also important. But again, how do you show scale through fragmentary parts of an archive? Or you're just showing snippets of text rather than showing book images of book covers. Number 5, lastly, emphasize process, pleasure, and thoughtful engagement rather than functional satisfaction of an information need, right? The search bar. One quick note on why I like these as a pair. Whitelaw is basically saying the same thing about digital information as Bailey is saying about archival organization schemes. Bailey is saying we're sort of trapped in this antiquated system of organization by creator or by acquisition. Whitelaw is saying we're trapped in this antiquated digital model of retrieval via search. Improving both of these, the organization and the interface, are challenges in resisting the legacy and inertia of the archive or any institutional system, really. And this is where many, if not all, of the readings that we've done so far about archival power and silences and identity and cultural memory and so on have come from. The recognition that not only do archives serve as an extension of colonialism, minimizing certain voices and communities, identities, and so on, but also that there's no self-corrective built into it. Archives do evolve. Archivists have new techniques. They come up with new priorities. They have new organizational schemes. They have other voices, both demographically as archivists and the kinds of stuff that they're trying to preserve. But once you have an organizational principle in place, respect to phones. Once you have an information technology infrastructure in place, search and databases designed to facilitate faster searches, implementing changes like turning an ocean freighter around. It takes a lot of planning, a lot of time. You really have to be committed to what you're doing. Change is slow, and there's a tremendous cost for even the smallest misstep. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources, and archives and libraries don't have either one of those. They don't have time, they don't have resources, and their primary function is to give people what they want. So changing the interface, changing the organizational scheme, these are really, really sort of catastrophic changes in the sense that people will be instantly disoriented. And so even if the change is better, people are more uncomfortable using the archive than they used to be. You've all experienced this as some app or website all of a sudden looks totally different than you're used to, and you're like, how do I figure out how to do what I already knew how to do? It might be better in the long run, of course, but change is always a process, especially when you've got these very large, complex systems of knowledge and archival material already in place. So this is a real weight. This is a real hindrance to innovation. So the articles for today that are getting us to think about how interfaces and organization might change, they don't really talk about the practical reality of the fact change is super hard and how difficult it is to implement interface change. They're trying to get us to think big, to dream about what kind of interfaces and organizations would be most useful to us. Okay, your project this week. In short, you're going to critique a interface to some kind of archive. I've listed a bunch of sites on the syllabus that you can choose, but you can use anything you want. I want to emphasize that here. You can Google a topic that you're interested in and find an archive related to that topic. The site, the content really has no bearing on the assignment. You can pick whatever you want. Understand what the assignment is about. I'm going to bring up the guidelines page in a second here. Understand what you need to do and make sure you can do it with the site that you pick. But as long as you think you can, you're good. And as long as it's an interface to an archive, you'll be fine. Make sure the archive isn't super small, like 6 items or whatever. Like if it's really, really tiny, you're just not going to have enough to talk about. It can be millions of items. It could be hundreds of items, thousands. It doesn't matter as long as it's not just a tiny few number of things. Remember, we're defining archive in very broad terms. So you can go to any kind of museum website. You can go to a formal repository, government data, the National Records Administration, NARA.gov, Library of Congress. These are all interfaces to archives. So you can pick anything. It can be kind of boring. It could be it could be a little bit more exciting in terms of interface. I tended to leave off the more standard sort of library archive sites from the list on the syllabus, but you're welcome to use those if you'd like. It can be a huge government website. It can be an independent community website. It can be a personal hobby project of somebody who's cataloging a whole bunch of stuff. Again, make sure it's not super small, but really it can be anything. Just something that mediates access to cultural heritage or data in some way. Okay, let me bring up the guidelines here. Okay, I just want to emphasize a couple of things. The basic requirements, straightforward. This is a lot like your archival silences assignment where you're going to have a separate page. And you'll see why in a second. 800 to 1,000 words, so same length. Have the URL of the site you're critiquing at the top or somewhere on your site so I can click and go to that site and mess around with it. One thing that's new, we're sort of expanding our facility with our website, so you're going to include 4 screenshots of the site you're critiquing. If you don't know how to do a screenshot, Google it. And I'm sorry, that sounds really flippant for me just to be like, well, you figure it out. But it's actually easier if you try to figure it out than me try to guess what operating system you have and version of operating system you have. It's really easy. I've never had anyone had more than 5 seconds of difficulty doing screenshots. Many of you already know how to do it. If you get really stuck, let me know. I'll do my best to help. But really, it's going to take you 30 seconds to figure it out, even if you've never done it before. Okay, what's your critique about? Well, I've given you sort of 2 things I want you to write about. One's going to take up about 1/3 of space and one about 2/3 of the space. The first thing you want to do is, I'm reading in this section here, is explain what the site does. What are the main features? How much does it facilitate access? How much can you see about context? What are things that work well or maybe need a few tweaks? It's basically you're critiquing what a user can do. You're critiquing what is this interface as it exists. Most of your critique, though, 2/3 of it, is really addressing questions about what's not there. So really getting into the readings that we've been doing over the last month. What kind of sense do you get of what's not in this archive? What are you not seeing? Where are the silences that are relevant to this kind of archive? What kinds of discovery does the interface enable? What kind of interpretations does it enable? What kind of discovery and interpretation does it resist? What would a more generous interface look like? What kinds of concepts from Whitelaw would be useful for your particular site? Don't worry if it's technically impossible. That doesn't matter. We're trying to imagine better interfaces for archives here. Okay, one thing I say about 12 different ways on this page, use the readings from the course to do your reviews, your critiques, okay? The assignment, if I'm getting into the pro tips here, the assignment is not just to do a critique that maybe you could have done before the class started, but to write an informed critique based on the readings and lectures. That's what I'm really looking for, an informed critique. Just telling me what you like or don't like about the site, that's great, but I really want to see you explaining how the interface limits or doesn't limit access to archives in ways that we've been talking about and seeing in our previous readings. Okay? The point of the critique is to show how the interface acts as a source of archival power. That's the starting point. Okay? You shouldn't talk about how it's limiting power as your conclusion. Right? We know that. That's established. The question is, how does your interface do that? Show how it does that. Talk about the silences, talk about the gaps, talk about scale. Avoid writing, these are things that I've seen happen in the past that I want to make sure you don't do. And it's very easy to do these. I've done it myself when I've written reviews of websites of one kind or another. Avoid writing a process narrative. I clicked on this, I clicked on that, I got confused, I had to go back. Nobody cares what you clicked on. Nobody cares. They want to know what you took away from that experience. Okay? So here's an example of things that I've seen, and again, that I've done, that I've spent a lot of time revising out of reviews that I've done. The navigation bar does this and this and this and this, and then you have to click here, and then if you want to do this, you have to go over here. And then the result is browsing a collection isn't that easy, right? So I've said all of these words here. I've written all of these words just to make this point. The standard navigation bar does not easily facilitate browsing the collection. That's the takeaway. The fact that I had to click here and got confused and had to do this other thing, too much detail for a high-level review. The point is, browsing isn't easy as it should be. Don't describe obvious things. The navigation bar allows the user to click directly in the section most relevant. I know how navigation bar works. All of your readers, which is kind of all of us, know how navigation bars work. Don't describe basic things. Just say it's standard, more or less, and make your point. Browsing's not as easy, okay? Lastly, don't miss the forest for the trees, which is to say, keep a high-level overview of what's going on. Think about the interface as a whole and how it works together. Don't get hung up on a particular page or set of pages. Think about how the whole interface is working, what it's allowing the user to do, what you're not able to do. Okay, so that's it. That's your assignment. Let me know if you have any questions. I've tried to write out everything you need to know on the guidelines page that we were just looking at. The readings are pretty straightforward. You shouldn't have any problems. But let me know if you do, if there's any confusion. I look forward to your posts later in the week. Have a good weekend. Have a good week. Talk to you later.